Hey there! Last week, I got the chance to go to Rivian's AI and Autonomy Day at their campus in Palo Alto. And while I was there, I was able to talk to a lot of their engineers about the upcoming autonomy tech in the R2, and there is a lot to talk about, so let's get right into it. Rivian has made it very clear that autonomy is a major part of their plan moving forward, as evidenced by their AI and Autonomy Day last week. They came out swinging with a lot of big things on R2, and honestly, they really needed to. R2 is set to be a big seller for them, both because of the smaller form factor and the lower price. So if it's going to far outsell R1, then they really needed to nail it. And that's why they came out swinging with a ton of announcements. So the really big one is RAP1, the Rivian Autonomy Processor, their in-house built system on a chip. And let me tell you, the thing looks like an absolute beast. 800 TOPS of AI performance. To give you a little bit of context for that, the most high-end GPU that you can get on a gaming PC right now, the RTX 4090, performs at about 1300 TOPS. In the new Rivian Autonomy Gen 3 computer, it has two of their processors at 800 each. That gives you 1600 TOPS of performance. That's 300 more than the top tier consumer gaming GPU that people have in these very high-end computers. Now, one little caveat that might need to go along with this, I'm not entirely sure if they intend to use these two processors as redundancy or as parallel processing. If they're using it in a redundant configuration, you have one processor with its 800 TOPS of performance, and then the other processor is mirroring it, running the same software at the same time. So if there's any kind of failure with the system, it can fail over to the other processor and continue operating as normal. If this is the case, even though there's 1600 TOPS worth of performance on the board, you're really only ever getting 800 of them at a time. But if they decide to use it in parallel configuration, you'll lose that redundancy factor, but you do gain a ton of performance with those 1600 TOPS, which is an insane amount of processing power. Why they might want that insane processing power, well, we'll come back to that because that has to do a lot with the sensors. But just going through the other specs real quick. It's built on TSMC's 5nm process, which is an extremely power efficient design. It's the same one that Apple used for their M1 chips. It has 3-channel memory processing data at 205 gigabytes per second, which is an insane amount of throughput for memory. As a quick side note, if you're thinking of buying a Rivian and you find this information useful or interesting, use my referral code. You'll get up to 500 points to the Rivian shop and free charging, which is great. I don't want to get too into the weeds on the specs on the processor, but that is a ton of power. Even if we do get only 800 TOPS because it's running in redundant configuration, that is still far more processing power than the R1 Gen 2 NVIDIA configuration has. So why do they need all of that? Well, let's talk about the cameras. There's 11 cameras around the vehicle, which is the same number as the R1 Gen 2, excluding Mobileye, but that doesn't exist for all intents and purposes, so we'll just forget about that one. There's 3 cameras on each side mirror, 1 bumper camera on front, 1 bumper camera on back, and 2 windshield cameras, a wide angle and a more narrow angle. And then the last 11th camera is the cabin camera on the inside for driver attention monitoring. Now, an interesting thing is I would have assumed that all of the cameras around the vehicle would be the same as R1, but that's not the case. They're all actually similar, but with the slight spec bump, they have a slightly higher dynamic range, things like that. The extra 10 megapixels, if I had to guess, would probably come from the interior cabin camera, because on R1, of all of the cameras around the vehicle, the only one that is not a Rivian design, at least from my understanding, is the interior cabin camera. That camera that's built into the rear view mirror on the inside is actually a Magna design. And if Rivian has shown us anything, they are a huge fan of vertical integration. My guess is that being the one camera they don't own, that's probably the one that they upgraded the most with the extra megapixels. So There's 10 extra megapixels somewhere. My money's on that one, but all of the rest of the cameras have probably about the same resolution, but a little bit upgraded dynamic range. So similar to R1, but slightly upgraded. That's the theme here. Moving on to the radars, it has one radar in the front that's the imaging radar, and then one on each corner. And as before, they slightly upgraded these corner radars. These have been upgraded with a dual mode radar, so it has a long range and a short range. As it stands in the R1 right now, the corner radars are all just long range radars that it uses, when cruising around town to figure out where their vehicles are for lane changes and things like that. The short range mode would be more useful for parking situations, for example. So the idea is that it replaces the sonars that are on the bumpers, which is honestly probably a good thing. It's a lot less complexity in manufacturing and a lot less that can go wrong. Fewer sensors, fewer things that can go wrong. So if the implementation with the hardware and the software is done well, I don't think drivers will really notice the difference. It will just look like a normal parking sensor. So that's probably a win for cost and complexity. And then there's the LiDAR, which is a huge departure from the paradigm of R1. So why did they do it? What purpose does the LiDAR serve? Well, I think there's quite a few reasons for it, but the big one, it seems, is filling in those edge cases. As Vidya said in her presentation on AI and Autonomy Day, the cameras do the bulk of the heavy lifting when it comes to their autonomous driving. So what they're looking for is a huge amount of redundancy and safety. When you have three separate systems, cameras, radars, and LiDARs, you can have a whole bunch of data coming in that you can be sure is sound. As long as at least two of the systems agree, then you have a pretty good idea of what's going on around you. Sure, in 99% of driving scenarios, the cameras handle things just fine. But for that last 1%, it's still extremely important, especially when it comes to level 4. As RJ said in his presentation, they're targeting personal level 4 autonomy where the vehicle can drive itself without you even being involved at all. You can send it off to pick up the kids or something like that. And if it's going to perform tasks like that, it's going to need to have 100% of situations covered. And so even though cameras cover most of it, the LiDAR and the radar help fill in. For example, when it's foggy outside, the cameras maybe don't do as well and the LiDAR probably doesn't do so well, but the radar exceeds. But when it's dark outside, the cameras don't do as well and the LiDAR exceeds. And so they all kind of fill in with their various strengths. So that, I think, is one major reason they went with the LiDAR. Another big one is data collection. As it stands right now, Rivian uses what they call their Penguin fleet to get the ground truth. This means that it has an extremely high level of fidelity and mapping that they augment onto the data that they're collecting from just regular consumer-owned vehicles. This helps them train their large driving model a little bit better and get their what they call the data flywheel moving. The problem that inherently comes from that, though, is there's only a limited number of drivers and miles and ground you can cover with this Penguin fleet, which is why they're collecting a whole bunch of data from the R1 Gen 2 vehicles that are out in the world now. But this is going to allow them to get a lot of what they call the ground truth data from the R2 vehicles. There are going to be even more R2s than there are R1s driving around. And with these extremely high resolution LiDARs attached to all of these R2s driving around, they're going to be collecting even more of this ground truth data, which just accelerates their flywheel even more to create more competent driving models more quickly. And this will benefit drivers of the R2 and even the R1 Gen 2, because all of these vehicles benefit from the same models. And that's what brings us to software and how this affects R1 Gen 2. When it comes to software, just like anything else that Rivian is doing these days, the name of the game is vertical integration. They own the whole thing from top to bottom. So starting at the bottom, you can visualize it like this. You have your hardware underneath, your Gen 2 hardware, your Gen 3 hardware in the new R2 vehicle, and then sitting on top of that is your middleware. This is the hardware abstraction. That means that the AI models that are running on top of it can run on any hardware underneath without extra development cost. This really helps them to run a universal platform across many different generations. And on that note, one of the things that Rivian did talk about on their Autonomy Day is the fact that R2 will not have this new Gen 3 hardware on it from launch. It's not going to launch until the end of 2026. So what does all this mean for the R2 that doesn't have the Gen 3 computer and doesn't have the new LiDAR on it? Does that mean it's going to be left out in the cold? And same thing for R1 Gen 2? Well, not exactly. This hardware abstraction layer means that they can run very similar software on the two platforms. When we went on the demo drive with the point-to-point self-driving that they had on Gen 2, and mind you, this was a stock Gen 2, just plain old production model, just like any other R1 Gen 2 that's driving on the street. But when we went on that drive, it was fully functional on that Gen 2 hardware. And speaking with the engineers about it, they said that there is still definitely headroom left in the system. And at this point, they haven't even tried to optimize the software yet. They haven't tried to make it run smaller and faster. This is just the initial engineering build we're seeing. So they still do have a bit of headroom on even the Gen 2 processor before it runs out of capacity. And so I think for the next while, we'll probably see pretty close to feature parity between R1 Gen 2, R2 with the Gen 2 computer, and the new R2 with the Gen 3 computer and the LiDAR. We'll probably see a lot of very similar features in all of these platforms. But once we get much farther down the road towards the hands-off, eyes-off driving and later the personal level 4 driving, that's where we will definitely see a convergence in the hardware, even if there still is some processing headroom left. Because even though there may still be processing headroom left for those kinds of scenarios in the R1 Gen 2, it doesn't have the extra LiDAR. And it seems that they're using this as a safety net for those hands-off, eyes-off scenario, the personal level 4 scenario. Because that 1% of cases where the car could not see something and cause an accident, they do not want to risk it. So even though they technically could do it with the cameras pulling the bulk of the heavy lifting, my guess is they will just never turn that feature on for R1 Gen 2 because it doesn't have that extra layer of safety and redundancy. And they've made it very clear they are going for a lot of safety and redundancy. But it is a long time before we get to that point because they still have to nail their point-to-point driving system. And it does look extremely promising and they're headed the right direction, but it still has a long way to go. So with the new data collection, even though the R1 Gen 2 may never get that feature turned on, so to speak, it will absolutely benefit and it will just scale by leaps and bounds because it's benefiting from all of the learnings and the data collection of R2. So I think it's a win-win for the next long while. The Gen 2 platform is far from dead. There's still a huge future for both Gen 2 and Gen 3 platforms, and I cannot wait to see where it goes. If you want to see my thoughts on the rest of the announcement at Autonomy Day, you can check out my video here. And if you want to see my more detailed look at the point-to-point self-driving demo, get subscribed because that one's coming next. So LiDAR, and then there's the LiDAR, and then there's the LiDAR, which is the LiDAR. Ugh, okay. Woo! All right, let's go. It's in Palo Alto, and I got to chat.